Rotten old woman, nobody loves you.
I never thought my life would fall apart at 65. After 43 years of running the Compass Antique, the maritime antique store my husband Robert and I had built from nothing, I believed I'd earned some peace. The small coastal town of Marblehead knew me as a respectable businesswoman, an expert in naval artifacts, and a widow who'd preserved her husband's legacy through hard work and dedication. What I hadn't realized was how quickly that reputation could be dismantled by someone I'd welcomed into my family. The first signs of trouble began on a brisk October morning. The shop bell chimed as I finished polishing an 18th-century brass sextant, one of my favorite pieces in the collection. My daughter Meredith entered, followed by her husband Ethan. I could tell something was different from the way she avoided my eyes, while Ethan's smile seemed too wide, too practiced. "Mom, we need to talk about the store," Meredith said, her voice carrying a rehearsed quality that immediately put me on edge. I continued polishing the sextant, a habit I'd developed over years of difficult conversations. The repetitive motion helped me think. What about the store? Ethan stepped forward, taking control of the conversation as he often did. "Ruth, we've been thinking. You're not getting any younger, and this place is a lot of responsibility for someone your age." I remember pausing, the cloth still against the brass, and looking directly at him. Ethan had always been handsome in that unremarkable way. Sandy hair thinning at the temples, blue eyes that never quite warmed when he smiled. He'd married my daughter 15 years ago, and while I'd never been particularly fond of him, I'd respected their marriage. "I'm perfectly capable of running my store, Ethan. I've been doing it since before you were old enough to count." Meredith sighed. That familiar sound of exasperation I'd heard increasingly over the years. "Mom, please don't be difficult. We're concerned about you. You've been forgetting things, staying late at the store, not taking care of yourself." I looked at my daughter, searching for the little girl who used to help me price items on summer breaks, but found only a stranger who wouldn't meet my gaze. Meredith had her father's gentle features, round face, dark eyes, and a softness that made her an excellent teacher, but had always made her susceptible to stronger personalities, like Ethan's. "I don't forget things," I said firmly. "And I stay late because I have inventory to catalog. Nothing has changed in 40 years of running this business." Ethan moved around the counter, invading my space in a way that made me clutch the sextant tighter. "Ruth, we've spoken with Dr. Harrison. He agrees that your behavior has become concerning. The forgetfulness, the irritability." "You spoke to my doctor?" The betrayal stung more than I wanted to show. "That's confidential information. As your family, we have a right to know," Ethan said smoothly. "We're just looking out for your best interests." I remember how the light from the shop window caught the brass in my hands, sending a sharp reflection across Ethan's face. In that moment, I saw something I'd missed for years, a calculating gleam in his eyes that had nothing to do with concern. That conversation was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, I noticed small changes in how people treated me around town. Mrs. Finch at the bank asked me twice if I remembered my account numbers. Old customers began speaking louder and slower. The town that had respected me for decades was suddenly treating me like I was fragile and confused. I discovered why on a cold January evening. Preston O'Malley, my late husband's fishing buddy and one of the few people who'd known Robert before I did, stopped by the shop just before closing. "Ruth, got a minute?" he asked, removing his weathered captain's hat. Preston had aged like the sea itself, salt white hair, face lined from years of sun and wind, but with clear eyes that missed nothing. "For you, always," I said, gesturing to the small sitting area where I sometimes entertained serious collectors. He settled his large frame carefully onto the antique chair, placing his hat on his knee. "I'm hearing things around town I don't much like, and figured you should know." My hands stilled on the ledger I'd been updating. "What kind of things?" "Ethan's been talking. Says you're showing signs of dementia. That you've been making mistakes with the shop finances. That you confused a replica with an authentic piece last month and nearly committed fraud." Preston's weathered face was solemn. "He's telling people you're not fit to run this place anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd noticed the whispers, the strange looks, but hearing it laid out so plainly made the betrayal concrete. "That's absurd," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I've never confused a replica in my life. My records are meticulous. Preston nodded. I know that, Ruth. Anyone who really knows you knows that. But Ethan's convincing, and he's got Meredith backing him up. That night, after closing the shop, I went through every financial record from the past year. Each entry was precise, each transaction documented. But when I checked the store's second bank account, the one I'd established for larger purchases, I discovered withdrawals I hadn't made. Significant amounts, drawn out over months in a pattern designed not to raise immediate alarms. Only 3 people had access to that account: myself, Meredith, and, since last year, when I'd foolishly added him as a financial advisor, Ethan. The next morning, I confronted them both at their home, a modest colonial on Elm Street that I'd helped them purchase with a substantial down payment. I brought the bank statements, circled in red, prepared for denial, but expecting some shame. What I wasn't prepared for was Ethan's cold dismissal. You obviously made those withdrawals yourself and forgot, Ruth, he said, barely glancing at the papers I'd placed on their kitchen table. This is exactly what we've been worried about. I did not forget withdrawing $70,000. My voice rose with indignation. This is theft, Ethan. Plain and simple. Meredith looked distressed, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. Mom, please calm down. Ethan handles our finances. If he says you made those withdrawals, then you did. I turned to my daughter, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. Meredith, look at the evidence. Look at the signatures. That's not my handwriting. It's close enough, Ethan said with a shrug. The bank accepted it. I realized then what had been happening. The careful groundwork, the rumors about my mental state, the gradual isolation. It had all been preparation for this moment. If everyone believed I was losing my mind, who would believe me when I accused my concerned son-in-law of theft? I'm going to the police, I said, gathering the statements. That's when Ethan's mask slipped completely. He snatched the papers from my hands, his face contorting with an ugly anger I'd never seen before. No one will believe you, Ruth. We've made sure of that. You're just a rotten old woman with a failing memory. Nobody loves you enough to take your word over mine. The cruelty of his words struck me silent. I looked at Meredith, waiting for her to defend me, to show some sign that she recognized the monster her husband had become. Instead, she looked away, tears streaming down her face but offering no support. I left their house with nothing but the certainty of what I was facing. By the time I returned to the shop, I found the locks changed. A notice on the door indicated that due to health concerns, the Compass Antique would be under new management effective immediately. Legal documents had been filed, documents I supposedly signed but had never seen, transferring operational control to Ethan. I was homeless that night. The apartment above the shop where I'd lived since Robert's death was no longer mine to enter. With nowhere else to go, I walked to Cantos Bay, the small grocery store owned by Thelma Quimby, the closest thing I had to a friend outside of business acquaintances. Thelma took one look at me standing in her doorway after closing hours and ushered me inside without a word. She was a sturdy woman with practical hands and a no-nonsense attitude who'd run her store alone since her husband died 20 years ago. "You look like you've seen the devil himself," she said, setting a cup of tea in front of me. I told her everything, expecting the same doubtful looks I'd been receiving all over town. Instead, she listened without interruption, her shrewd eyes narrowing at certain details. When I finished, she nodded once. "I never liked that man. Too smooth by half. Reminds me of those plastic-wrapped cheese slices. Looks like the real thing until you taste it." That night, Thelma offered me the small apartment above her store. It was nothing like my comfortable home, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was shelter. "It's temporary," she insisted, showing me the space, "until we sort this mess out." The next week passed in a blur of humiliation and bureaucracy. I went to the police, who took my statement but clearly had reservations. Officer Jenkins had known me for years, but even he seemed unsure whether to believe my account or the more palatable story that a respected local accountant was protecting his mother-in-law's assets as her mind failed. The bank was similarly unhelpful, pointing to authorization forms with what appeared to be my signature. I insisted they were forgeries, but without proof, my claims gained no traction. I visited my doctor, demanding to know what he'd told Ethan and Meredith. "I never said you had dementia, Ruth," Dr. Harrison assured me, looking troubled. "I told them that occasional forgetfulness is normal at your age, but that you showed no signs of cognitive impairment during your last physical. Then why does the entire town think I'm losing my mind?" He sighed, removing his glasses. "Because they've been told a convincing story by people who should be looking out for you. I can write a statement clarifying my medical opinion, but it might not matter," I finished for him. Walking back to Thelma's store that evening, I passed the Compass Antique. Through the window, I could see Ethan showing a customer around, pointing to items I'd carefully collected over decades, speaking with an authority he didn't possess. Beside him, Meredith smiled politely, playing her role as the dutiful daughter who'd stepped in to help her confused mother. The sight nearly broke me. Everything I'd built, everything Robert and I had created together, was being stolen in broad daylight while the town looked on with pity, not for the victim of the theft, but for an old woman they believed had lost her grip on reality. That night, lying on the creaking bed in Thelma's spare room, I allowed myself one evening of despair. I thought about the life I'd built, the respect I'd earned, and how quickly it had all been stripped away. I thought about my daughter, who'd chosen her husband's lies over her mother's truth. I thought about giving up. But when morning came, something had hardened inside me. I was Ruth Pemberton. I had built a business from nothing when experts said a woman couldn't succeed in the maritime antique business. I had survived the loss of my husband and kept our dream alive for 15 years on my own. I would not be discarded so easily. Over breakfast, I told Thelma my decision. I'm going to fight back, not just for the store, but for my name, for the truth. Thelma smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen in days. "Well, it's about damn time, and I know just who you should talk to first." That afternoon, I met with Nancy Wickersham, the accountant whose office was just down the street from Ethan's. Nancy had always been cordial but distant whenever we'd crossed paths at town functions. She was meticulous to a fault, with a reputation for catching errors others missed. "I've been watching Ethan Dunbar's career with interest," she said, after I explained my situation. Her office was spotless, every pencil aligned, every paper perfectly stacked. His meteoric rise in the local business community has always struck me as convenient. "Convenient how?" I asked. Nancy tapped her fingers on her desk. "He arrived in Marblehead 10 years ago with no connections, no reputation, and a resume that checked out but somehow felt incomplete. Within a year, he had several of the town's wealthiest residents as clients. Within 2, he was married to your daughter and handling the finances for half the businesses on Main Street." She pulled out a file from her cabinet. "I've kept notes on discrepancies I've noticed over the years. Nothing definitive, nothing I could take action on, but patterns that didn't sit right." As she spread the documents before me, I began to see the outlines of something far larger than the theft of my store. Ethan had been systematically siphoning small amounts from multiple businesses, conducting real estate transactions that benefited him through shell companies, and using his position of trust to manipulate financial records. "I need concrete evidence," I said, studying the patterns Nancy had identified. "Something that proves beyond doubt that he's committing fraud." Nancy nodded. "And to get that, we need access to records only he controls, including those from your store." Over the next week, a small alliance formed around my kitchen table in Thelma's apartment. Nancy brought her financial expertise. Preston contributed his extensive network of contacts throughout the town and his unwavering belief in me. Thelma offered practical support and a place to operate from. And then there was Dottie Sorensen, an 83-year-old widow who'd been one of my most loyal customers for decades. She arrived at our third meeting leaning heavily on her cane, her thin white hair perfectly set as always. "I heard what happened to you, Ruth," she said without preamble. "And I think that no good son-in-law of yours sold me a fake." She placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a compass that Ethan had assured her was from an 18th century whaling vessel, a rare piece worth the $5,000 she'd paid. I examined it carefully, my heart sinking as I noted the inconsistencies. The patina that had been artificially applied, the brass that wasn't quite the right composition, the etching style that wasn't period appropriate. "This is a reproduction," I confirmed. "A good one, but definitely modern. Worth maybe $200. Dottie's lips thinned to a determined line. I want him held accountable. And so our plan expanded. We weren't just fighting for my store anymore. We were exposing a fraud who had victimized others in the community. Through careful investigation, we discovered that Ethan had been selling reproductions as authentic pieces, pocketing the substantial difference. He'd been falsifying provenance documents, using the Compass Antique's sterling reputation to lend credibility to his schemes. Nancy's review of the financial records we could access revealed that Ethan had significant gambling debts from online poker sites. His need for cash had become increasingly desperate over the past year, which explained the accelerated timeline of his takeover of my business. But our most significant break came from an unexpected source. Preston's nephew, who worked for the FBI in Boston, took an interest in our case when patterns emerged, suggesting tax fraud and interstate commerce violations related to the fake antiques. The feds don't care about a family dispute over a store, Preston explained, but they care very much about systematic tax evasion and wire fraud. By the end of February, just 6 weeks after I'd been forced out of my home and business, we had compiled enough evidence to present to the authorities. Preston's nephew arranged for me to speak with his colleagues who specialized in white-collar crime. I'll never forget the day the FBI agents visited the Compass Antique, warrant in hand. I watched from across the street as Ethan's confident smile faded to confusion, then panic. Meredith stood frozen beside him, her world collapsing as agents began boxing documents and computer equipment. That evening, my daughter came to Thelma's store, her eyes red from crying. "Is it true?" she asked when Thelma led her upstairs to my apartment. "Everything they're saying about Ethan?" I placed the evidence before her. The financial records, the photographs of fake antiques, the statements from victims like Dottie. Meredith read in silence, occasionally wiping tears from her cheeks. "I believed him," she whispered finally. I thought he was protecting you from yourself." The hurt was still too raw for me to offer easy forgiveness. "You chose to believe the worst about me, rather than question him. That's not something I can forget overnight." She nodded, accepting this harsh truth. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mom, but I want to help make this right." Meredith's testimony proved invaluable in the case against Ethan. She revealed conversations she'd overheard, documents she'd seen, patterns of behavior that corroborated our evidence. The case against him grew stronger by the day. 3 days later, Ethan was arrested at their home, charged with multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The local newspaper, which had delicately avoided mentioning the family dispute at the Compass Antique, now ran front-page coverage of the arrest and the schemes he had perpetrated. When I returned to my store, accompanied by a court officer executing the order restoring my ownership, I found chaos. Inventory had been misplaced, valuable pieces sold without proper documentation, and the careful systems I'd developed over decades ignored. But beneath the disarray, the bones of the place remained. The wide pine floors Robert had insisted on installing himself. The custom display cases we'd saved for months to afford. The smell of lemon oil and history that had always meant home to me. That night, as I reclaimed my apartment above the shop, I sat by the window overlooking the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the moonlight. The journey wasn't over. There would be court cases, testimony to give, a reputation to rebuild. But I had survived the worst of it. I thought about Ethan's sneering words. "You're just a rotten old woman. Nobody loves you." He had been wrong. Not just about the love of friends who stood by me when it mattered, but about the fundamental strength he'd underestimated in me. I was not rotten, but resilient. Not worthless, but valuable. Like the authentic antiques I'd spent my life preserving. And as for love, well, I had discovered that respect sometimes runs deeper than the easy sentiment that Ethan had used to manipulate my daughter. As winter gave way to spring, I began the painstaking work of rebuilding what had been damaged. The store, my relationship with Meredith, my standing in the community, none of it would be easy, but then nothing worthwhile ever had been. And as for Ethan Dunbar, he would learn what it truly meant to have nothing. No shortcuts, no schemes, no one's fortune to steal. Just the cold reality of consequences that had finally, rightfully caught up with him. Spring in Marblehead brought with it the cleansing scent of salt air and the distant clanging of rigging against masts as the sailing season began. For me, it also brought the first day of Ethan's preliminary hearing. I dressed with particular care that morning. A navy suit I'd worn to business appraisals, pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 30th anniversary, and my most sensible shoes, armor of sorts, for the battle ahead. Thelma arrived at 7 to drive me to the courthouse in her ancient station wagon. She'd insisted on accompanying me, though I'd told her it wasn't necessary. "Not necessary, my foot," she'd said. "I want to see that weasel's face when he realizes the game is up." The courthouse steps were crowded with people, some curious townsfolk, others reporters from Boston papers who'd picked up the story of a respected local businessman charged with fraud. I kept my head high as we ascended the steps, aware of the whispers that followed. The woman who'd claimed dementia, the mother-in-law who'd accused her daughter's husband of theft. Only now, the whispers carried a different tone, one of realization and, from some embarrassment at having believed the lies. Inside, the courtroom was wood-paneled and formal, with hard benches designed for discomfort. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, where Assistant District Attorney Marcus Fitzgerald shuffled papers with practiced efficiency. He was younger than I'd expected when Preston's nephew first introduced us, but his eyes held the sharp focus of someone who missed nothing. Fitzgerald had taken a personal interest in the case, recognizing it as more than just financial fraud. "He used the trust of a community to isolate and victimize you," he'd told me during our preparation meetings. "That's predatory behavior, and I intend to make an example of him." At precisely 9 o'clock, Ethan was led in from a side door. He wore an ill-fitting suit that hung loosely on his frame. Jail food apparently didn't agree with him. The confident smile I'd grown to detest had been replaced by a tense grimace as he surveyed the packed courtroom. His eyes met mine briefly before darting away, unable to maintain contact. The proceedings began with formal charges: 7 counts of fraud, 3 of tax evasion, 2 of falsifying business records, and 1 count of elder financial abuse, a charge Fitzgerald had insisted on despite my objection to being labeled as elderly. "It carries stronger penalties," he'd explained, "and it accurately reflects the particular cruelty of his actions." Ethan's public defender, a harried woman with a perpetually loose bun, entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. Then came the bail hearing. "Your Honor, Mr. Dunbar has deep ties to this community," his lawyer argued. "He's married, employed, and poses no flight risk." Fitzgerald countered immediately. "Mr. Dunbar has multiple accounts under assumed names, connections to online gambling sites with offshore operations, and recently inquired about expedited passport services. He's charged with stealing over $300,000 from his mother-in-law alone, with evidence suggesting other victims. The Commonwealth requests remand." The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose, considered both arguments before rendering her decision. "Bail is set at $500,000, cash only," she announced. "Defendant will surrender his passport and is prohibited from contacting the victim or conducting any financial transactions exceeding $100 without court approval." From my seat, I watched Ethan's shoulders slump. We both knew he didn't have access to that kind of money. Not legitimately. Whatever funds he'd squirreled away were either gambled away or frozen in accounts now under investigation. As he was led back through the side door, Ethan's eyes found mine again. This time, there was something different in his gaze. A desperate plea that I recognized from years of dealing with customers trying to negotiate prices. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized they had miscalculated their position entirely. Outside the courthouse, several reporters approached me for comment. I'd prepared for this, knowing that public perception would be crucial to rebuilding my reputation and business. "I'm grateful to the district attorney's office for taking these crimes seriously," I said carefully. "This case isn't just about me. It's about protecting elderly business owners from predatory individuals who abuse positions of trust." That afternoon, I returned to the Compass Antique for the first time since being restored as its rightful owner. The shop had been closed during the investigation, the windows covered with brown paper. Removing the paper felt symbolic, letting light back into a space that had been darkened by deception. The interior was worse than I'd remembered. Display cases stood half empty. The inventory ledgers were a mess of inconsistencies, and there was a fine layer of dust on surfaces that had never, in 40 years, been allowed to collect dust. But beneath the neglect, the bones of my beloved shop remained strong. I spent that entire day cleaning, cataloging what remained, and making lists of what was missing. Nancy had agreed to help reconstruct the financial records, working backwards from bank statements and sales receipts to create an accurate picture of what Ethan had stolen. As I worked, occasional customers peered through the windows, some tentatively knocking despite the "closed for inventory" sign I'd hung on the door. Word spread quickly in a town like Marblehead. By mid-afternoon, Dottie Sorensen arrived with her fake compass and a determined expression. "I've spoken with 6 other people who bought authentic pieces from Ethan," she informed me, settling her thin frame onto the customer chair. "We've all filed statements with the prosecutor's office." I paused in my inventory to examine her compass again. "You know, the irony is that this isn't even a good fake. Anyone with basic knowledge would have spotted the inconsistencies." Dottie sniffed. "Well, I trusted the Pemberton name. We all did." Her words stung, though I knew she hadn't meant them as an accusation. Trust in my expertise, in my integrity, had been weaponized against my own customers. That would be the hardest damage to repair. Over the next 2 weeks, more victims came forward. Ethan had been busy in the months he controlled my shop, selling reproductions as authentic pieces, using the store's reputation to lend credibility to his schemes. The preliminary evidence suggested he'd defrauded customers of nearly $200,000 through fake antiques alone, separate from what he'd stolen from me. But the most damning evidence came from Meredith. She arrived at the shop one evening as I was closing up, clutching a laptop. "I found this hidden in the crawl space of our attic," she said, her voice hollow. "It's Ethan's personal computer, the one he never let me use." I called Fitzgerald immediately. Within hours, FBI technicians were extracting data that would prove crucial to the case. Spreadsheets tracking multiple fraudulent schemes, emails to buyers of fake antiques, communications with offshore gambling sites, and drafts of the documents he'd used to wrest control of my business. The computer also contained something I hadn't anticipated, a journal of sorts, where Ethan had detailed his plans and rationalizations. He'd targeted me specifically, identifying my business and savings as the solution to his mounting gambling debts. He'd noted my exploitable weaknesses, my estrangement from Meredith, my tendency toward privacy that could be reframed as secrecy, and my age. "Ruth is perfect," he'd written, "old enough to be discredited, wealthy enough to solve everything, isolated enough that no one will fight for her." Reading those words in the sterile conference room of the district attorney's office, I felt a cold rage unlike anything I'd experienced before. This hadn't been opportunistic theft. It had been calculated predation. "This changes things," Fitzgerald said, reviewing the journal entries. "This shows premeditation, planning, targeted victimization. With this evidence, I'll be pushing for maximum penalties." The following week, Ethan's lawyer requested a meeting. The charge list had grown substantially with the new evidence, and the possibility of decades in prison had apparently sobered Ethan's defiance. "My client is willing to enter a guilty plea to reduced charges," the lawyer offered across the conference table. "He'll make full restitution to Mrs. Pemberton and the other victims." Fitzgerald glanced at me before responding. We'd discussed this possibility. "Restitution is a starting point, not a settlement. Your client systematically defrauded elderly victims and attempted to have his mother-in-law declared incompetent to steal her business. The Commonwealth will accept nothing less than guilty pleas on the major counts with appropriate incarceration." The negotiation continued for hours, with me sitting silently beside Fitzgerald, watching Ethan grow increasingly desperate. The confident man who had sneered that no one loved me was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't meet my eyes. When his lawyer stepped out to make a phone call, Ethan finally addressed me directly. "Ruth, please, we're family. I made mistakes, but I can fix this. Tell them you don't want me to go to prison." I studied him for a moment. This man who had nearly destroyed everything I'd built, who had turned my own daughter against me, who had made me doubt my sanity. "We were never family, Ethan," I said quietly. "Family doesn't do what you did." The plea agreement was finalized the next day. Ethan would plead guilty to 14 felony counts, including fraud, financial elder abuse, and tax evasion. He would serve a minimum of 7 years in state prison, forfeit all assets derived from criminal activity, and make restitution to all identified victims. The sentencing hearing was set for the following month, giving both sides time to prepare statements and documentation. During that time, I focused on rebuilding the Compass Antique. The physical restoration was straightforward: cleaning, reordering stock, repairing display cases. The less tangible restoration of trust would take longer. I decided to host an open house, inviting the community to visit the shop for refreshments and informal appraisals of their maritime collectibles. It was a gesture both practical and symbolic, reclaiming my role as an expert while re-establishing connections with neighbors who had been misled. Preston helped spread the word through his extensive network, and Thelma contributed her famous cranberry scones. Nancy volunteered to explain the fraud to anyone with questions. Her precise accountant's vocabulary perfectly suited to describing what had happened without emotional embellishment. The day of the open house dawned bright and clear, with a breeze that carried the promise of summer. I arrived early to make final preparations, arranging refreshments on the antique sideboard that had been the first piece of furniture Robert and I had purchased for the shop. At precisely 10 o'clock, I unlocked the doors. For a terrible moment, I feared no one would come, that the damage to my reputation had been too severe, the embarrassment of having believed Ethan's lies too fresh. Then Dottie Sorensen appeared, leaning on her cane, but moving with purpose. Behind her came the Marsdens, longtime customers who had purchased their first piece, a ship's bell, from us in 1982. Then more familiar faces, some apologetic, others pretending nothing had happened, but all of them present. By noon, the shop was filled with neighbors, customers, and even a few tourists who'd heard about the upcoming sentencing of the antique fraudster, as the Boston papers had dubbed Ethan. I moved through the crowd, answering questions about various artifacts, accepting awkward apologies, and gradually feeling the weight of isolation lifting. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Meredith arrived. She had been keeping her distance, our relationship still raw with hurt on both sides. She moved tentatively through the shop, touching familiar objects from her childhood, before approaching me. "The shop looks like itself again," she said. I nodded. "It's getting there." We stood in uncomfortable silence until she spoke again. "I've been seeing a therapist, trying to understand how I could have chosen him over you. And what have you learned?" I kept my voice neutral. "That I've been looking for someone to rescue me my whole life. From what, I'm not even sure." She traced the edge of a display case. "I thought you were so strong you didn't need me. But he convinced me you were weak and needed protection from yourself. I wanted to be needed." The insight surprised me. I had always seen Meredith as an extension of myself, capable, independent, needing nothing but opportunity. Had I missed something fundamental about my own daughter? "I needed you," I said finally. I just didn't know how to say it. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. The day of sentencing arrived with a courthouse even more crowded than before. The case had attracted attention beyond Marblehead, highlighted in a Boston Globe series about financial crimes against the elderly. I wore the same navy suit, the same pearl earrings, my armor for this final battle. Ethan's appearance had deteriorated further. The ill-fitting suit hung looser, his face gaunt beneath stubble that hadn't been properly shaved. His eyes, once shrewd and calculating, now darted nervously around the courtroom. The proceedings began with victim impact statements. Dottie spoke first, describing not just the financial loss, but the violation of trust that had left her questioning her own judgment. 3 other victims followed, each describing similar experiences. Then it was my turn. I had prepared my statement carefully, writing and rewriting it over several nights until the words captured exactly what I wanted to convey. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the tension in my chest. "Ethan Dunbar didn't just steal money from me. He attempted to steal my identity, my reputation, and my dignity. He convinced my community that I was incompetent, my daughter that I was failing, and very nearly made me question my own sanity. I described the isolation I'd felt, the humiliation of being locked out of my own business, The systematic way Ethan had exploited the respect I'd earned over decades. The financial losses can be calculated and perhaps one day repaid. But there is no restitution possible for having my own child believe I was mentally incompetent. There is no compensation adequate for being called a rotten old woman that nobody loves, for being discarded as worthless after a lifetime of contribution to my community. I looked directly at Ethan as I continued. I am not seeking vengeance, Your Honor. I am seeking justice. Not just for myself, but for every older person who fears being dismissed, devalued, or exploited because of their age. Ethan Dunbar saw my gray hair and assumed it made me vulnerable. I want the sentence to ensure that he and others like him recognize that targeting the elderly doesn't make victims easier. It makes the crime more reprehensible. When I returned to my seat, the courtroom was silent. Fitzgerald squeezed my arm once in silent support before rising for his sentencing recommendation. The judge listened attentively to both the prosecution and defense before delivering her decision. Her voice was measured but firm as she addressed Ethan directly. Mr. Dunbar, the crimes you have committed are particularly disturbing because they targeted individuals who should have been able to trust you implicitly. You deliberately isolated a respected member of your community, attempted to destroy her reputation and relationships, and exploited your position as a family member to commit financial crimes. She adjusted her reading glasses before continuing. The court cannot repair the damage you've done to these relationships, nor fully restore the dignity you attempted to strip from your victims. What the court can do is ensure that you face appropriate consequences for your actions and are prevented from victimizing others. The sentence exceeded even Fitzgerald's recommendation. 9 years in state prison, restitution to all victims plus punitive damages, and permanent revocation of any financial or accounting licenses. As the gavel fell, finalizing the sentence, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a profound weariness and the sense that a chapter had closed. Ethan's destruction hadn't been worth the cost, but at least justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters again sought comment. This time, I was more prepared, more centered in my response. Today's sentence sends a message that exploiting older adults has serious consequences, I told them. I'm grateful to the district attorney's office and to this community for ultimately standing against predatory behavior, regardless of how respectable the perpetrator might appear. That evening, I hosted a small gathering at the Compass Antique for those who had supported me through the ordeal. Thelma, Preston, Nancy, Dottie, and, somewhat tentatively, Meredith. We didn't celebrate the sentencing. It wasn't that kind of occasion. Instead, we acknowledged the end of a difficult journey and the beginning of reconstruction. As twilight settled over the harbor, visible through the shop's front windows, I raised a glass of the good sherry I reserved for special occasions. To weathering storms, I said simply. Preston, ever the old sailor, smiled. The best ships aren't the ones that never face storms, he replied. They're the ones still sailing afterward. Looking around at these people who had stood by me when it mattered most, I felt something I hadn't expected to find again after the betrayal. A sense of belonging, of community restored. Ethan had been wrong about so many things, but most fundamentally about this. I was not unloved. I was not worthless. I was Ruth Pemberton, 65 years old, owner of the Compass Antique, survivor, and I was just getting started. Summer in Marblehead always brought a particular quality of light that painters had tried to capture for centuries. A golden clarity that made the harbor waters shimmer and turned ordinary buildings into studies of shadow and illumination. That summer, 3 months after Ethan's sentencing, I found myself noticing this beauty with a sharpness I hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was the contrast with the darkness I'd emerged from, or simply the awareness that nothing, not even the familiarity of seasons, could be taken for granted. Whatever the reason, I found myself pausing more often during my walks to the shop, appreciating the town I'd called home for nearly half a century. The Compass Antique was slowly regaining its footing. The physical restoration had been completed within weeks. New display cases installed where damaged ones couldn't be salvaged, inventory meticulously cataloged, and the apartment above restored to its former comfort. The less tangible restoration of customer confidence was progressing more gradually, but with encouraging signs. Regular customers had returned first, those with decades of history who knew my expertise was genuine. Then came the curious, drawn by the notoriety of the case, but staying to browse when they found the shop's atmosphere compelling. Finally, new collectors began to appear, referred by existing clients or attracted by the small advertisements I'd placed in regional antiquing publications. To address the lingering doubts about authentication that Ethan's fraud had created, I instituted new policies. Each significant piece now came with detailed provenance documentation, photographs highlighting distinguishing characteristics, and a certificate of authenticity bearing both my signature and a notarized verification. It was additional work, but necessary to rebuild trust. Nancy had helped me implement financial safeguards as well. We established a dual signature requirement for major transactions, regular external audits, and a transparent system for tracking inventory that customers could access if they had concerns about an item's authenticity. "You're setting the gold standard for the industry," Nancy remarked during one of our monthly review meetings. "Other dealers are starting to adopt similar practices." I hadn't intended to become a model for reform in the antique business, but there was satisfaction in knowing that some good might emerge from the ordeal. If my experience helped prevent others from falling victim to similar schemes, perhaps the pain had served a purpose. The restitution payments from Ethan's seized assets had begun to arrive, though the total was far less than what he'd stolen. The gambling debts had consumed much of his ill-gotten gains, and what remained had been spent on maintaining appearances, leasing a luxury car, taking expensive vacations, buying designer clothes that created the image of success that helped perpetuate his schemes. The financial recovery was important, but secondary to the restoration of my reputation. I'd lived modestly my entire life, reinvesting most profits back into the business. What Ethan had nearly destroyed wasn't my financial security, but my life's work, the respect I'd earned as an expert, the relationships I'd built with customers and colleagues, the legacy Robert and I had created together. That legacy was now secure again, and even expanding in unexpected ways. I'd been approached by the local community college about teaching a course on maritime antiques and authentication. The invitation had come through Preston, whose niece served on the college's board. "They need someone who can spot a fake at 20 paces, Preston had explained. "And after what happened with Ethan, you're the most qualified person in 3 counties. I'd initially hesitated. Teaching had never been part of my plan, and I wasn't sure I had the temperament for it. But the idea of sharing my knowledge, of helping others develop the expertise to protect themselves from fraud, held a certain appeal. My first class met on Tuesday evenings in a small classroom overlooking the harbor. The students were a diverse group: retirees developing second careers, young people interested in antiques as a profession, and several local shop owners seeking to improve their authentication skills after hearing about Ethan's schemes. Teaching forced me to articulate knowledge I'd accumulated through decades of hands-on experience, the subtle differences in brass composition between centuries, the evolution of navigational tools, the characteristic wear patterns that couldn't be convincingly faked. I found myself enjoying the challenge, particularly when students brought in family heirlooms or recent purchases for evaluation. "This is definitely mid-19th century," I told a young woman who'd brought in a ship captain's writing desk. "The dovetailed joints show hand-cutting consistent with that period, and the inkwell has the distinctive depression for a sand shaker that fell out of use by the 1870s. The woman beamed. "My grandfather always said it was valuable, but no one believed him. He'd be so pleased to know he was right." These moments of connection, of validation, reminded me why I'd devoted my life to preserving maritime history. Each authentic piece carried not just monetary value, but human stories: the craftsmen who'd created it, the sailors who'd used it, the families who'd passed it down through generations. In authenticating these objects, I was helping preserve those narratives. As summer progressed into early fall, my relationship with Meredith continued its cautious rebuilding. She had moved out of the house she'd shared with Ethan, taking a small apartment near the school where she taught. The divorce proceedings were underway, uncomplicated by children, but emotionally fraught nonetheless. Our conversations remained somewhat formal, with carefully observed boundaries on both sides. We met for coffee at neutral locations, never the shop, which held too many complicated associations, and never her new apartment, which felt too much like choosing sides in a way I wasn't prepared to do. The 7th graders are studying the age of exploration, she mentioned during one of our meetings at the Harborside Cafe. I thought maybe, if you had some appropriate artifacts at the shop, you might consider doing a presentation? It was the first time she'd referenced my expertise, acknowledged my professional capacity since the ordeal began. A small olive branch, perhaps, or simply a practical request from a teacher to a local resource. Either way, I accepted. The presentation to her students became a turning point in our healing process. Watching Meredith in her classroom, confident, engaged, clearly respected by her students, I saw her through new eyes. Not as an extension of myself or a victim of Ethan's manipulation, but as a complete person with her own strengths and capabilities. She, in turn, witnessed the respect my knowledge commanded as the students passed around the carefully selected items I'd brought: a miniature astrolabe, a sailor's palm thimble, a ship's log from the 1850s. Their eager questions and rapt attention validated my expertise in a way that court testimonials and newspaper articles never could. Afterward, as we packed the artifacts for return to the shop, Meredith spoke with uncharacteristic directness. "I should have known better," she said quietly. "I've seen you identify forgeries since I was a child. The idea that you'd suddenly lose that ability, I should have questioned it." I closed the display case before responding. "You trusted your husband. That's what you're supposed to do in a marriage." I trusted the wrong person. Her hands stilled on the leather case she'd been securing. "I've been thinking a lot about why, about what made me vulnerable to someone like Ethan." The classroom was empty now, the afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the desks. It felt like neutral territory, a place where we could perhaps speak more honestly than we had in months. "What did you conclude?" I asked. "That I've spent my life looking for validation from people who couldn't or wouldn't give it." She met my eyes directly. "From Dad, who was always focused on the shop. From you, who wanted me to be independent but never seemed to need me. And then from Ethan, who made me feel essential to his plans." The assessment stung, but I recognized the truth in it. Robert and I had raised Meredith to be self-sufficient, perhaps to a fault. We'd been proud of her accomplishments, but rarely expressed how much she mattered to us beyond them. We'd assumed she knew. "I've never been good at saying what matters," I admitted. "Your father was the same way. We showed our love through actions, through providing stability, through planning for your future. But maybe we should have said the words more often." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Something shifted between us in that classroom. Not a complete restoration, but a foundation upon which we might build something new and possibly stronger than before. As autumn painted Marblehead in russet and gold, the Compass Antique hosted its first major event since Ethan's conviction, an exhibition of navigational instruments spanning 3 centuries. I'd been planning the show for years, gradually acquiring key pieces and researching their historical context. But Ethan's schemes had derailed the timeline. Resuming the project felt like reclaiming another piece of my identity. I spent weeks preparing, arranging the displays chronologically to show the evolution of maritime technology, writing detailed descriptions for each piece, and creating a comprehensive catalog for serious collectors. The evening before the exhibition opening, I was making final adjustments when Preston arrived with an unexpected delivery, a rare 18th century octant I'd been trying to acquire for over a decade. "Belonged to a Whitcomb out of Salem," he explained, setting the carefully wrapped package on the counter. "The family's been holding on to it for generations, but when they heard about your exhibition, they decided it should be with someone who could appreciate its significance." The octant was in remarkable condition, its brass fittings still bright beneath a patina of age, the ivory scale clearly legible, the original wood case intact. It was exactly the centerpiece the exhibition needed, a perfect example of the craftsmanship and precision that had allowed sailors to navigate the world's oceans long before electronic aids. "They're selling it?" I asked, already calculating what such a piece would command. Preston shook his head. "Lending it. For now. They said they wanted to see it displayed properly before making any decisions about its future." The gesture represented more than just the loan of a valuable artifact. It was a vote of confidence from a family with deep maritime roots, an acknowledgement that despite Ethan's attempt to destroy my credibility, my expertise was still trusted and valued. The exhibition opening drew a larger crowd than I'd anticipated. Local collectors mingled with maritime historians from Boston universities, representatives from regional museums, and curious townspeople. Mayor Blackwell made an appearance, publicly acknowledging the Compass Antique's contribution to Marblehead's cultural heritage. A political calculation, perhaps, but a useful endorsement nonetheless. I moved through the crowd, answering questions, sharing anecdotes about particular pieces, and watching with satisfaction as visitors engaged with the history I'd spent my life preserving. Thelma manned the refreshment table, Nancy distributed catalogs, and Preston entertained a group of yacht club members with tales of historical navigation mishaps. Midway through the evening, I noticed Meredith arrive with a colleague from the middle school. She hesitated at the entrance, perhaps uncertain of her welcome at this public reclaiming of my professional identity. Then she squared her shoulders and moved into the crowd. I watched as she studied each display carefully, reading the descriptions, occasionally explaining details to her friend. She'd absorbed more knowledge of maritime artifacts during her childhood in the shop than she perhaps realized. Seeing her appreciation of the exhibition, of my life's work, felt like another small step toward reconciliation. The exhibition's success extended beyond that opening night. It received coverage in regional publications, attracted visitors from throughout New England, and led to inquiries from several museums interested in acquiring pieces from my collection. The Peabody Essex Museum in Salem even proposed a collaborative project documenting the maritime trade history of the North Shore through artifacts and personal accounts. This professional validation coincided with an unexpected personal development. Dottie Sorensen's grandson, an attorney who had helped her recover the money Ethan had swindled from her, approached me about establishing a consumer protection organization focused on elder fraud. "What happened to you and my grandmother isn't unique," he explained over coffee at Thelma's store. "Financial exploitation of older adults is epidemic, but it's underreported and underprosecuted." The statistics he shared were sobering. Billions lost annually to schemes targeting seniors, with only a fraction of cases ever reported due to shame, family complications, or victims' isolation. Even fewer resulted in prosecution or meaningful penalties. "We need advocates who understand both the financial aspects and the emotional impact," he continued. "Someone who can speak credibly about the experience while helping educate potential victims and law enforcement." The idea resonated with me. I'd emerged from my ordeal not just intact, but more determined than ever to prevent others from experiencing similar betrayal. My case had received attention because of Ethan's brazenness and the community connections that eventually helped expose him. But how many others suffered in silence, their losses dismissed as confusion or poor judgment, rather than recognized as crimes? I agreed to join the advisory board of the newly formed Coastal Elders Protection Alliance. My role would include speaking at community forums, consulting with law enforcement on fraud detection, and helping develop educational materials for financial institutions and senior centers. This new direction wasn't something I'd have chosen before Ethan's betrayal, but it felt right now, a way to transform a painful experience into something constructive. I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was expanding it, using what I'd learned to help others. As winter approached, bringing shorter days and the distinctive New England chill, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. The shop was thriving again, my reputation restored and even enhanced by the publicity surrounding the case. My teaching position had been expanded to include a second course on artifact authentication. The Protection Alliance was gaining momentum, with several banks adopting our recommended protocols for identifying potential exploitation. But the most significant change was more personal. I'd begun the process of formally taking Meredith into the business as a partner. It wasn't a decision made from guilt or obligation, but from recognition of complementary strengths. Her organizational skills, technological fluency, and connection to younger generations of potential collectors balanced my historical knowledge and established reputation. We'd discussed the arrangement carefully over several weeks, establishing clear boundaries and expectations. She would continue teaching while gradually increasing her involvement with the shop, focusing initially on developing an online presence and modernizing our record-keeping systems. "I'm not trying to replace you," she'd assured me during one of these conversations. "I'm trying to help preserve what you've built." "I know," I'd replied. "That's why I'm comfortable with this arrangement." The partnership agreement was finalized in early December, with Nancy overseeing the legal and financial details to ensure everything was transparent and equitable. We marked the occasion with a small ceremony at the shop, attended by the same friends who had supported me through the darkest days: Thelma, Preston, Nancy, and Dottie. As we raised glasses of hot cider, Thelma insisted it was too cold for sherry, I looked around at these people who had become more than friends. They were the family I'd chosen, or perhaps the family that had chosen me when I needed them most. Ethan had been wrong about so many things, but his most fundamental error had been in thinking that age made me vulnerable, that being 65 somehow diminished my value or resilience. He had seen my gray hair and assumed weakness. He had calculated that a rotten old woman would be easily discarded, easily forgotten. But age had given me something he hadn't accounted for: a lifetime of building connections, of earning respect, of developing the wisdom to recognize what mattered and the courage to fight for it. My 65 years weren't a liability. They were my greatest asset. As winter settled over Marblehead, wrapping the harbor in mist and occasionally dusting the colonial homes with snow, I continued the work of living, running my shop, teaching my students, mentoring my daughter, advocating for vulnerable elders. It wasn't the peaceful retirement Ethan had tried to force upon me, but it was richer, more purposeful, more authentically mine. And on the rare occasions when I thought of him, sitting in his prison cell with nothing but time to contemplate the failure of his schemes, I felt no anger, no resentment, only a profound gratitude that his attempt to destroy me had instead revealed strengths I might never have discovered otherwise. 5 years passed with the steady rhythm of coastal seasons. My 70th birthday arrived with little fanfare, but much contentment. The Compass Antique had not merely recovered, but flourished under the partnership Meredith and I had formed. Her modern approaches to marketing complemented my traditional expertise, bringing new generations of collectors through our doors. My work with the Coastal Elders Protection Alliance had expanded beyond Marblehead to influence policy at the state level. Last month, the Massachusetts legislature passed the Elder Financial Protection Act, incorporating many of our recommendations for strengthening penalties against those who exploit seniors. I had testified before the committee, sharing my experience with a composure that still surprised me when I recalled the humiliation Ethan had once inflicted. Meredith and I had found a new relationship, not the one we'd had before Ethan, but something more balanced, built on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. She had remarried last year to David, a kind history teacher who appreciated maritime antiques and treated her with genuine consideration. I received the certified letter on a crisp autumn morning. The return address was from the state correctional facility where Ethan had been serving his 9-year sentence. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the precise, controlled script of an accountant, though less confident than I remembered. According to the enclosed notice, Ethan was being considered for early release due to good behavior and prison overcrowding. As the primary victim, I had the right to make a statement at his parole hearing. The choice weighed on me for days as I considered whether to oppose his release or simply let the matter proceed without my involvement. "What would you gain from confronting him again?" Thelma asked when I shared my dilemma during our weekly dinner. At 73, she remained as direct as ever, though she had finally sold her grocery store to enjoy a well-earned retirement. Her question was exactly right. This wasn't about what Ethan deserved, but about what I needed for my own closure. After careful consideration, I decided to attend the hearing. The correctional facility was a utilitarian complex of brick and chain link 2 hours inland. Preston insisted on driving me despite his own advancing age, claiming his eyesight was still sharp enough to spot a buoy in a nor'easter. We arrived early, joining a small group of people waiting for various hearings in a sterile room with uncomfortable plastic chairs. When they called Ethan's case, I was escorted to a smaller room where 3 parole board members sat behind a table. Ethan was already there, seated at a side table with his attorney. He looked older, thinner, the confidence drained from his posture. When he saw me, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or apprehension. I delivered my prepared statement without emotion, addressing the board rather than Ethan. I neither opposed nor supported his release, but outlined the full impact his crimes had on me, the other victims, and our community. I described the elder protection work that had emerged from the experience and the legislative changes his case had helped inspire. Ethan Dunbar's actions caused significant harm, I concluded, but they also revealed the need for better protections for vulnerable adults. Whether he has genuinely reformed is for this board to determine. What matters to me is that the systems that allowed his exploitation have been strengthened to protect others. As I gathered my notes preparing to leave, Ethan spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Pemberton, I want to apologize." I raised my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I didn't come for an apology, Mr. Dunbar. I came to ensure the board fully understands the impact of financial exploitation on older victims. What you do with whatever freedom you're granted is your concern, not mine." Walking out of that facility, I felt lighter than I had in years. The ghost of victimhood that had occasionally still haunted me, despite all my recovery and success, finally dissipated. Ethan no longer had any power over my emotions or my life. Whether he served another year or was released tomorrow made no difference to me. 3 weeks later, I received notification that Ethan had been granted parole with strict conditions, including prohibitions against working in financial services and requirements to make continued restitution payments. The news arrived the same day as a more welcome letter. The Peabody Essex Museum was offering to purchase several key pieces from my collection for permanent display, with full attribution to the Compass antique. Life continued its forward momentum. The shop thrived under our joint management, with Meredith gradually taking on more responsibility as I focused on teaching and advocacy work. My course at the community college had expanded into a certificate program in artifact authentication and appraisal, bringing students from throughout New England. Last week, as I was closing the shop, I spotted a familiar figure across the street, watching the storefront. Ethan stood there briefly before walking away, never approaching. Whether he had come to apologize, to reminisce, or simply to see what he had lost, I would never know. More importantly, I had no desire to know. His presence registered as nothing more than a footnote in a story that had long since moved beyond him. That evening, I sat in my apartment above the shop, the same space Ethan had once locked me out of, and felt profound gratitude, not for what he had done. The betrayal had been genuine and painful, but for what had emerged from that crucible. Stronger family bonds, deeper community connections, a broader purpose that extended beyond my own business interests. At 70, I had more energy, more influence, and more joy than I'd experienced at 50. The rotten old woman Ethan had sneered at had not only survived his attempt to discard her, but had thrived in ways he could never have imagined. The final victory wasn't in seeing him punished, but in realizing how completely irrelevant he had become to my life's continuing story. If you've been through something similar, know that you're not alone. There's strength in sharing our stories and fighting back against those who try to diminish us. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more real-life experiences and subscribe to my newsletter where I share resources for elder protection and community building.